It's my pleasure to present Michael Masucci, who's a video artist, producer, director, and creative director of Easy TV in Los Angeles, which is a known facility for filmmakers and videography artists who are looking for an alternative space. It has been acknowledged by the American Film Institute and other institutions in Los Angeles as being pioneering and of consequence for artists in the area. Thank you
so much.
Yeah, okay, that's right.
Okay. All right, thank you. And just the acknowledgement that always needs to happen. One of the things we're going to talk about today is not just about what perhaps certain academic institutions that happen to have funding and power are choosing to chronicle, archive, and remember, but some of the things that temporarily, at least, have fallen through the cracks. And I would say emphatically that when an accurate history of whatever the word that sticks with your community is when we talk about its art, its founding author is Natasha Vita-More, and you really have a privilege to be in the privilege of that woman. All right, so who am I and why should you care? You shouldn't. And for the most part, a lot of the subjectivity about what art and design does is ultimately, to me, an anthropological and a cultural matrix rather than anything having to do with what a scientist would normally be seeking, this ambiguous word called a fact. For me, I am far, far, far more interested in why you think something is art than whether it is or not, because ultimately, to me, art is the manifestation, the ephemera, the excreting of cultures. And there have been many, some of which have been powerful enough for economic or military reasons, that have managed to perpetuate and enlarge themselves, and many of which we know perhaps only a name or scrap of paper or a piece of hieroglyphic. And much of the culture and art that we have had up to this point, we're guessing at. There was a time, it said, in the Middle Ages, in what is now would be called Germany, Switzerland, France, where people would be walking out of the forest and stumble upon this strange thing, these paths carved into the ground with these huge boulders in them. And technologically, they had no idea how anyone could make such a thing. They certainly couldn't make such a thing. And the smartest minds among them, their wise people, their shamans, their professors, sat down and decided they must be giants. They must have been made by a race that no longer exists. Well, to some extent that was true. They were called the Roman Empire. And they had completely forgotten that they existed. And had it not been for some Irish monks copying and recopying for generations the few vestiges of the ancient past, the Roman Empire might be a myth like Atlantis today. And we must never forget, as we talk about the replication of data around the world, and we talk about the technological abilities to preserve on multiple platforms in multiple engineering ways around the world, that sometimes it doesn't quite work. So who are we? I don't have the slightest idea, and you know it's not my problem. For a lot of people, who we are is a European or high technological Asian human being with a Amex gold card and the ability to travel and the ability to go to universities and the ability to, what I would say, do intellectual colonization of the planet by perpetuating their view of the world. Genevieve happens to be my friend. She's an artist, performance artist in Los Angeles. All of the images you see are kind of how my little stupid group Easy TV works, purely collaboratively. There's actually a collaborator here that we met at the Irvine IEET conference. Professor Boyce from Maryland. I live in Santa Monica. A number of colleagues come together, and since this presentation is a freebie, I had to put together a presentation based on a collaborative process that is completely DIY. And it is the only way Easy TV ever survived and really prefers to continue to. So when I hear the talks, and a gentleman who was sitting next to me earlier today introduced himself, and he said to me, "What's your discipline?" And I thought for a minute, and being the smart ass that I sometimes like to be when I'm awake, I say, well, I prefer to think of myself as undisciplined. I prefer to think of myself as someone who really doesn't want to be departmentalized, who really doesn't think that the university notion of departments is a 21st century model that really seems to work. And throughout yesterday and today, I've heard more and more people talking about the art-science collaborative as a given rather than an exception. I think that's great, and I also think it's old news, because it's always been that way. There has never been a time when art and science were not incredibly lovers. The Sphinx in Egypt, an amazing piece of whatever you call it. Is it a work of art? Is it a work of geological knowledge? Is it a work of masonry? Is it a work of science? Of course, to those people, they didn't use those distinctions. Actually, to them, it was a work of what we would now call religion, but they called it science. So when we see this new future that I think it is going to happen, some form of it. Not the wildest expectations or not the worst scenarios. It doesn't statistically ever seem to pan out that way. That just doesn't seem to be how things happen. Things tend to be banal. They tend to sort of be in the middle. But however it happens, somebody is going to decide, and it isn't going to be me, and my guess is it isn't going to be you either. And I want to know, how much does this future cost, and can I afford it? I already know the answer. Much of it I can't afford. That well-quoted notion that the future is here but disevenly distributed, there's another way of thinking of it. The future's here and I can't afford it. Jetpacks exist, I'm not going to be buying one tomorrow. Ferrari F40s exist. I'm not going to buy one of those either. So when we talk about this wonderful, wonderful world, who do you think is going to be on the short list? I know it isn't going to be me, but I suspect Vladimir Putin's going to be on that list. I suspect a lot of people are going to be on that list that personally may not be the best people the world has yet to produce. So I'm really, really, really interested in the ethical considerations as to how we unfold this distribution. Because it's one thing to have an iPod. It's quite another thing to have the enormous infrastructure to actually do what I think may plausibly happen. So how do we paint this picture as artists? I hear over and over again in this community that they really, really like pop culture. And they really, really, really like these mainstream movies of sci-fi. I do too, but I treat them as what they are. They're entertainment. They're not predictive tools because they have been ridiculously inaccurate. They always have been. One of my favorite works of art is 2001. I think it is one of the great masterpieces of human endeavor as a work of art, but as a work of prediction, it was pathetic. Think of the space station we really have. a couple of train cars welded together with some solar panels. It's an embarrassment. But supposedly 10 years ago, we were going to have a floating city with anti-gravity and be launching a space mission to Jupiter. We were going to have not one, but numerous moon bases. And you know what? When they made that movie, those people were brilliant. Kubrick was brilliant. Clark was brilliant. They just happened to be wrong. And it doesn't mean it isn't art, but it certainly doesn't mean it's a way of thinking about your tomorrow. For me, one of the things that storytelling in pop culture does that I think is really a problem is that it has to have story arc. And it has a dramatic turning point on page 30. And it has to have good guys and bad guys. And guess what? It's really easy for some hack writer in Hollywood to make you the bad guy. It's an easy plot point. It really does sell those movie tickets. It's a lot easier for the scientist to be mad and the computer to go crazy and want to decimate the planet than it is to tell what is more probably a banal reality of, well, yeah, so we're beginning to feel that this apparatus is sentient in some ways, and we don't really have a clue what that sentient reality is relative to us. I'm sorry, that doesn't sell movie tickets. So as we talk about culture and the cultural interface between high science, I suggest we start talking about some high art too. There was one of the things in my history is the art of forgetting thing is I'm going to reference other people from this conference without mentioning their name and see if you remember who they were. Sometimes you will. One speaker spoke about apparatus to come in which you could experience some sort of conversational therapeutic experience with some sort of database of cliched responses. I don't know about you, but to me that's a pretty boring thing to do. But I immediately said, wait a minute, that's not the future. That's art history. So while the guy was talking, I emailed an 80-year-old performance artist named Barbara T. Smith and said, Barbara, didn't you do something like this a long time ago? And she said, yeah. She sent me this email. She said it was 1977 at Caltech for a show called The Many Arts of Science. The piece was called I Am Abandoned. She listed collaborators, and she said the program used was called Doctor. And what people would do for this art piece, again, not a Star Wars multimedia giant pop culture extravaganza, an obscure piece of art history at a major university, people would sit down to a computer and they thought they were talking to a live psychiatrist. They were talking to a program. Now, pop culture will fail to mention these kinds of references. But any of you who claim yourselves to be scholars, you better damn start. You better see that a lot of what's going on has happened in the most esoteric parts of art just as much as it has in pop commercial culture. So we all have this sort of vision of what we think is our perfection, except me. As you see, I have chosen not to fix my broken nose or my Lauren Hutton's gap in my teeth. I think if you judge me because of those things, I don't want to talk to you. Damn. So the realities are that those people obsessed with some sort of subjective, Eurocentric, northern concept of beauty, I hope you're not the ones on the short list. Unfortunately, I suspect a lot are. So, we've forgotten a lot. We've forgotten a lot about Carthage. Carthage lasted for like 3,000 years. That's a pretty long run. We don't know a lot about it. We know something about the early days. We know the Romans kicked their butts. But an entire body of knowledge was reduced to rubble by very low technology, not by nuclear proliferation, not by major kinds of DARPA technologies, but by shields and swords and chariots. And, what could happen now with this guaranteed preservation? I don't know. And what happened to the people in the past who dared too soon, too fast? They called them things like witches, and they would have these wonderful parties where you would have this live event where they would burn them in front of people. They also did it to people who didn't quite fit in the world view of the accepted social practice. And guess what, dudes? They did it to advanced thinkers. Hypatia, the oldest known female mathematician. The urban legends are kind of conflicted now, but the general consensus is she was skinned alive and then burned. Why? Well, sexism was certainly an aspect, but you know, it wasn't just because she was a woman. The math part had something to do with it too. And what about Giordano Bruno? Burned. Because what? He thought the Earth wasn't the center of the universe? Madness. And what about the less distant past? Antoine Lavoisier. Guy, came up with oxygen. Not a bad theory, right? To the guillotine. I'm sorry, guys, but sometimes there's technophobia. Sometimes there are people who are dealing with issues not because they are factual, not because they are true, but because of their biases. And a lot of those things have to do with political, social, and legal issues. And there was a gentleman yesterday who asked about the legal applications of this, and correctly he was told, you guys cover that. I would suggest cover it more. Because when you create a technology, especially one that interfaces with the human body, well, there's a lot of legal things that kick in. One's called Food and Drug Administration. There are many, many, many entities that have not been collaborating with you who are going to tell you all of a sudden that they have jurisdictional control and that they get to decide whether you are correct or not. There have been numerous technologies that have been correct that our society has decided, who cares? Remember the moon missions? Now, I'm one of those people who still believes we went to the moon. I don't believe it was a Cold War strategy to scare the Russians. I think we probably did it. I know a lot of kids who don't. They don't believe it ever happened. It's like, well, if they did it, why can't they do it now? Why is it going to take 15 years now when it took 7 then? How come if they had computers then that were less powerful than my watch, how come we can't do it? And I said, well, but I believe they did it. But we stopped doing it. The will of the people stopped it. The science can do it, the science can still do it, but the will of the people said, what are they going to do with a bunch of rocks? So the great thing about you genius guys is you're good with math and you put stuff together and it's really cool. I like to use it. I was joking with somebody, I don't call myself a futurist, I call myself a presentist. I use stuff that's here right now. I'm real happy to use stuff in the future when the future comes. But right now, I use the stuff I can go get at Best Buy. And I'm really interested that that stuff work and be reliable and be accessible to more people than it is. More than just Genevieve. And this stuff costs money. The world that wants to be created ain't cheap. And I don't know about you guys, but I am not personally a billionaire. Maybe the rest of you are, maybe most of you are. I personally am not a billionaire. So I personally, if I wanted this to happen, I would need to break bread with somebody who's got real deep pockets. And you know what? Usually they want a deal. And that deal means they need to get a lot out of this. So that complicates the development, and it complicates the speed of implementation, and it mandates legal, sociological, political, and economic considerations from day one. There was a gentleman earlier who gave a great question, and he said that there was this really wonderful, promising thing that was possible in 1970. Only problem was it was too expensive. Well, I don't want to be a cynic, but to me, if an idea is too expensive, it's not a good idea. It's not real. And so I want to know who's going to own our future. Who owns the infrastructure that powers all of this? Who are the political people who make the decisions? And who gets to make the voting on it? Again, I know they're not going to be asking me. To me, art is the design. This is a design school. I have actually took 2 years here, back in the Middle Ages. Design is the bridge between art and science. And art, to me, is an applied anthropology. It is not, I know for a fact this is what's going to go on, and in 2045, this will happen. Art is, well, I don't know, I got a feeling this is going to happen. And that's why I think art is really, really important, and why I think that any science project that does not from day one collaborate with scientists isn't worth very much. And so to do this, in addition to collaborating with a bunch of artists who, met me outside my studio and I took pictures of them and made those stupid digital images, I also wanted to consult with a computer scientist and an attorney. So Linda McDonald-Glenn and Jeanne Boyce, they touched base with us before I did this, because I think the only art that matters is art that deals with scientific ideas, and the only science that matters is the science that deals with artistic ideas. Because to me, the best art is scientific, and the best science is artistic. Thank you very much.